Evelyn Mark, Emma and Lucas Thompson, names that once stood for a picture-perfect family, would become synonymous with one of the most chilling Christmas Eve massacre in modern history. What began as a festive night in their cozy Willow Creek home ended in unimaginable bloodshed, leaving behind shattered lives, buried secrets, and a haunting question: who could have committed such a heinous act against them? Evelyn Mark, Emma and Lucas Thompson were the kind of family that inspired envy in their tight-knit suburban community. Mark, a well-regarded dentist, was known for his charisma and generosity, often hosting charity events to support local causes. Evelyn was the quintessential PTA mom, always organizing bake sales, carpooling for school trips, and charming everyone with her warm, approachable demeanor. Their teenage children, Emma and Lucas, were equally admired. Emma was a talented violinist with aspirations of joining a prestigious conservatory, while Lucas, though quieter, excelled in sports and academics. To neighbors and friends, the Thompsons were the embodiment of holiday spirit and family togetherness. On Christmas Eve, their house glowed with festivity. Multicolored lights illuminated the lawn, a meticulously decorated tree stood in the front window, and strains of Christmas carols played faintly in the background. From the outside, it seemed like another peaceful holiday night in Willow Creek, but behind closed doors something far more sinister was unfolding. Just after midnight, the serene neighborhood was disrupted by a strange occurrence of single frantic 911 call made from the Thompson residence. The call lasted only a few seconds before the line went dead. The operator could hear faint muffled sounds of distress, but the connection was severed too quickly for a response, though it was the kind of night where the police might have brushed off such an incident as a technical glitch. The vague unease in the operator's gut prompted her to send a patrol car to the scene. When officers arrived, the house was eerily quiet, its festive glow casting eerie light against the snow-covered yard. The front door was locked, but no one answered despite repeated knocks. Concern mounting, the officers circled to the back of the house, where an ominous sight awaited them. The sliding glass door stood slightly ajar. A trail of bloody footprints in the freshly fallen snow led away from the house and toward the shadowy expanse of the woods behind the property. Inside, the scene was nothing short of a nightmare. Evelyn and Mark's lifeless bodies were discovered in the living room, slumped near the remains of a holiday display. Broken ornaments littered the floor, shards glinting in the soft glow of twinkling lights still plugged into the wall. A blooded crowbar lay nearby, its handle streaked with fingerprints. Upstairs, Emma and Lucas were found in their respective bedrooms, both showing signs of a struggle. Emma's violin, once her prized possession, lay shattered on the floor, a stark symbol of a life cut tragically short. As investigators began their work, questions swirled. Why had someone targeted the Thompsons on such a joyful night? How had the attacker entered without any sign of forced entry? Most haunting of all, who had made the call to 911, and why had it been cut short? It would be days before these questions even began to be answered, but the gruesome discovery that night was only the beginning of what would unravel into one of the most shocking crimes the small town had ever seen. The investigation into the Thompson family massacre began with a harrowing walkthrough of the crime scene. For detectives, the scene told a fragmented story, one filled with desperate resistance and unimaginable violence. The living room where Mark and Evelyn had been found bore the hallmarks of a brutal struggle. A toppled coffee table, smashed picture frames, and blood spatter on the wall suggested the parents had fought fiercely for their lives. On the couch, a torn piece of fabric clung to a jagged edge, hinting at the attacker's hurried movements. In the bedrooms upstairs, the discovery was even more haunting. Emma's room, once a haven for her artistic pursuits, was now the site of chaos. Her violin lay in splinters on the floor, the music stand toppled, the blanket on her bed was crumpled, and her desk chair had been overturned. On the wall near her desk, streaks of blood seemed to map her frantic attempt to evade her race. And across the hall, Lucas's room was similarly disturbed. The neatly organized sports trophies on his shelves had been scattered, and his basketball lay in the middle of the room, stained with a single bloody handprint. His bedside lamp had been knocked over, the shattered bulb casting eerie shadows on the walls. Despite the overwhelming brutality, there were puzzling inconsistencies. The absence of forced entry suggested the family might have known their attacker, or that the perpetrator had found another way in. Detectives focused on the back door, which had been left slightly open just outside. Footprints led away from the house, but their trail abruptly disappeared near the tree line, obscured by freshly fallen snow. It was his eye. After the killer had vanished into the night, the crowbar found near Evelyn's body was identified as the likely murder weapon, and initial forensic tests confirmed it bore traces of both Evelyn's and Mark's blood. The positioning of the tool near the body suggested it had been discarded in haste, possibly during the perpetrator's escape. The partial fingerprints recovered from the handle, however, didn't match anyone in the Thompson household, raising further questions about the identity of the intruder. The most perplexing clue came from the small Christmas card found on the mantelpiece in the living room. It was handwritten in blocky, uneven letters and addressed to the Thompsons. The message inside was chillingly brief: "The past always catches up to you." Investigators debated its significance. Was this the work of the killer or a red herring placed to mislead them? As the forensic team worked to reconstruct the sequence of events, neighbors were questioned for potential leads. Several were called. Seeing nothing unusual on Christmas Eve, their focus on holiday celebrations. One neighbor, however, reported hearing raised voices from the direction of the Thompson home earlier that evening, though they hadn't thought much of it at the time. With no immediate suspects and only fragmented clues, the investigation faced mounting pressure. The eerie details of the crime left the town in a state of unease, its residents haunted by the realization that the murderer could be among them. For detectives, the puzzle was only growing more complex, and the clock was ticking to find the answers hidden in the carnage. As detectives dug deeper into the lives of the Thompsons, a web of secrets began to emerge, revealing that beneath their picture-perfect facade lay a tangled history of deceit, strained relationships, and hidden tensions. At first glance, it seemed impossible that a family as seemingly solid as the Thompsons could harbor such dark secrets, but with each passing day, investigators uncovered disturbing details that painted a very different picture. Evelyn Thompson, long admired in the community for her charity work and flawless reputation, had recently been at the center of a scandal that had flown under the radar of the media but caused ripples among her close acquaintances. She had been involved in a significant embezzlement case at the non-profit organization where she volunteered. Though few people outside of the board of directors knew about it, rumors of stolen funds and accounting discrepancies had surrounded her for months, but it wasn't until the investigation revealed her questionable financial habits that the true extent of her involvement became clear. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Some were quick to believe Evelyn had been involved in the crime, motivated by fear that her secret would be exposed, while others wondered if she had been framed, perhaps the victim of an elaborate plot. Mark, the family patriarch, had also been dealing with his own mounting pressure. On the surface, he was a successful dentist with a thriving practice. However, police uncovered that he had been receiving anonymous threatening letters for several months leading up to Christmas. The letters contained veiled threats, many of them referring to Mark's past and the that what goes around comes around. Investigators learned that the threats might have been connected to a long-standing dispute Mark had with a former business partner. The two men had been close friends at one time but had fallen out bitterly after a failed venture, with accusations of betrayal and deceit on both sides. Mark had kept this conflict hidden from even his closest friends, perhaps knowing that the past could destroy the reputation he had worked so hard to build. While investigating the parents, the attention soon shifted to the children. Emma, a talented musician with dreams of a prestigious future, seemed to have the world at her feet, yet she had recently begun confiding in her close friends about unsettling incidents. She had mentioned a stalker who had been leaving cryptic notes in her school locker, messages that spoke of payback and the need for justice. Though Emma had not told her parents about these disturbances, it became clear that she was frightened. Emma's stalker, it seemed, had been targeting her over some unknown grudge. The timing of these incidents raised disturbing questions. Had Emma's stalker finally confronted her family on that Christmas Eve, or was someone else trying to send a message through her? Lucas, the more reserved of the two children, had been caught up in a personal struggle of his own. Earlier that year, he had been expelled from school after a violent incident with another student. The fight, though dismissed as a result of teenage frustration, had been far more aggressive than initially reported. Police unearthed records of counseling sessions Lucas had undergone in an attempt to manage his anger issues. Lucas had been withdrawn in the weeks leading up to Christmas, but whether his aggression had anything to do with his family's demise remained unclear. Could his own inner turmoil have been a catalyst for the tragedy. As the investigation progressed, each member of the Thompson family seemed to have a shadowy past that may have played a role in their tragic end. What was becoming increasingly clear, however, was that there were many people potentially outside the family who could have been affected by these secrets, and each person with a motive seemed to have a hidden connection to the tragic events of that Christmas Eve. It was not just the Thompsons' immediate lives that had been unraveling, but a larger network of relationships rooted in old grudges, buried resentments, and long-forgotten betrayals. The question now wasn't who had done it, but why had it all come to this, and was anyone truly innocent? As the investigation continued, a major breakthrough came when forensic evidence pointed to an unlikely and disturbing suspect: Ben Carter, Evelyn's estranged brother, a criminal with a sordid history. Ben had spent 10 years in prison for a string of violent robberies, and although he had been recently released, his relationship with the family had remained strained and fractured over the years. Evelyn had tried to distance herself from her brother, embarrassed by his criminal past and his many run-ins with the law. However, as it turned out, Ben had been harboring a deep resentment toward his family, particularly toward Mark. The connection between Ben and the Thompsons, which seemed so distant, came under scrutiny after detectives learned about an explosive argument that had taken place earlier that year. Ben had once been a partner in a now-defunct business venture with Mark, but their collaboration ended bitterly when accusations of stolen funds and betrayal surfaced. According to several sources, the falling out between the two men had been disastrous, with both parties accusing each other of dishonesty and deceit. The tension between them only deepened with Ben's imprisonment, where he seethed with anger and felt he had been abandoned by his family. This resentment appeared to have boiled over on Christmas Eve. Police learned that just days before the murders, Ben had shown up at the Thompson house unannounced, asking to reconcile and meet with Mark to settle old scores. His version of events suggested a plea for forgiveness, but the neighbors recalled hearing loud voices from the front porch, as if the two men had been engaged in a heated confrontation. When Ben was questioned about his whereabouts that night, he denied involvement, stating that he had been visiting a friend during the time of the killings. However, his alibi crumbled when detectives began to piece together his movements through security cameras at nearby locations. Despite his protestations of innocence, the investigation soon found Ben's bloodied fingerprints on the crowbar found at the crime scene. It seemed clear that Ben had been present in the house that night. However, the picture of the crime quickly became more complicated when more evidence came to light. While Ben's fingerprints were on the murder weapon, his DNA was not present on other critical pieces of evidence at the scene. In fact, a DNA sample collected from the footprints leading into the house suggested the presence of a second individual, a person whose identity remained a mystery. This revelation led to a deeper dive into the events surrounding the night of the murders. The second person, it turned out, had been none other than Emma Thompson's best friend, Zoe Martin. Zoe had often been at the Thompson house, and Emma and she were inseparable, but few knew of the craft beginning to show in their friendship. Zoe had recently begun showing signs of personal distress. A conversation with one of Emma's classmates revealed that Zoe had confided in them about her volatile relationship with Emma's family, complaining that they had always been dismissive of her, treating her as if she were inferior. Investigators uncovered that Zoe had been experiencing mounting pressure over financial troubles of her own and had been in debt to unknown sources. The twisted connection between Zoe and Ben was what stunned investigators. Ben, already consumed with bitterness toward the Thompsons, had manipulated Zoe into helping him carry out his plan. In return, he had promised her money to help alleviate her financial problems. Zoe, believing she was justified in punishing Emma's family for their perceived wrongdoings, had been an unwitting accomplice in the crime. When questioned, Zoe initially denied any involvement in the murders, but after persistent interrogation, her story unraveled and the truth began to surface. Zoe admitted to entering the house that night to scare the family, but had frozen at the sight of the brutal carnage unfolding. She fled before completing Ben's twisted plan, guilt-ridden but fearful of retribution if she didn't comply. The pieces of the puzzle now started to fall into place. Ben had orchestrated the massacre, planning to kill Mark and Evelyn and possibly pinning the crime on Emma or Lucas. Zoe had been part of the scheme, either knowingly or out of sheer manipulation, but when the brutality of the killings became clear to her, she fled the scene in terror. In the end, it was her AI-led participation paired with Ben's wrath that turned Christmas Eve into a nightmare no one in Willow Creek would ever forget. The investigation revealed not just the brothers' betrayal and the impact of financial strain but a young woman's spiral into desperation, a chain of decisions that culminated in a family's destruction as detectives pieced together the tangled events that led to the massacre. The case took a shocking turn. Ben Carter, once considered the prime suspect, was now at the center of a complex narrative that revealed more than just the violence of a family massacre. It exposed a disturbing web of manipulation, broken relationships, and the cost of carrying resentment for too long. Ben's arrest was swift as investigators were armed with irrefutable evidence, including his fingerprints on the crowbar and his trail leading from the crime scene. Despite his attempts to portray himself as an innocent man seeking closure, the evidence painted a different picture. When taken into custody, he remained calm, almost detached, as he was charged with the brutal murder of his sister, her husband, and their 2 children. It became evident that Ben had harbored an intense, decades-long grudge toward his family, one rooted in betrayal and resentment over a failed partnership with Mark. His plan for revenge had been elaborate yet simple: destroy the family he blamed for his misfortune. He manipulated Zoe Martin, Anna's best friend, into helping him, offering her a way out of her own financial struggles. But in the chaos of the crime, Zoe had hesitated, allowing the violence to spiral out of control and escape before it could fully unfold as planned. Zoe's confession was a turning point. After Ben's arrest, she became one of the most crucial pieces of the investigation, revealing details that had remained hidden during the initial weeks of uncertainty. She tearfully admitted that although she had intended to be part of Ben's plan to scare and rob the Thompsons, she never expected the level of brutality that transpired that night. Zoe claimed she had hoped for some kind of confrontation, thinking it might just teach Emma's family a lesson, but the events quickly spiraled beyond her control, leaving her feeling trapped and terrified, fearful for her own life. After witnessing the murders, Zoe fled into the night and went into hiding. Her cooperation with the police was pivotal in securing Ben's conviction. Ben, though, remained steadfast in his refusal to take full responsibility. In interviews following his arrest, he insisted that he had acted out of justice, believing the Thompsons had wronged him in the most unforgivable ways. His bitterness had seeped into every corner of his life, and when given the opportunity to strike, he had done so without mercy. Yet despite his attempts to justify his actions, the evidence told a different story: a man consumed by his past, willing to take innocent lives to satisfy his need for revenge. Zoe's involvement, however, presented a moral area. While she never physically harmed anyone, her manipulation, whether out of misguided loyalty or desperation, led to the family's downfall. She had allowed herself to become entangled in Ben's lies, and her attempt to back out only confirmed the confusion and chaos of that fateful night. The judicial system viewed her as a willing accomplice, though her sentencing was reduced due to her cooperation with investigators and the fact that she had no prior criminal record. The trial itself was a media spectacle, with the town in shock over the revelation of such a violent, calculated act within their very midst. Neighbors and community members who had once adored the Thompsons now reeled from the knowledge that those closest to them had harbored such darkness. The proceedings were marked by emotions ranging from anger to disbelief, as people struggled to comprehend how a family so seemingly perfect could fall victim to such ruthless betrayal. Ben was convicted of all 4 murders, receiving a life sentence without parole. His appeal for a reduced sentence was denied. Zoe, though not absolved of her part in the tragedy, was given a lighter sentence due to her honest testimony and the unique circumstances surrounding her involvement. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10. The case of the Thompsons, as devastating as it was, had one final unforgettable impact on the community. It reminded everyone that underneath the surface, even the most unassuming families could harbor secrets capable of unthinkable destruction. The family that once symbolized warmth and togetherness was forever tainted.